My pleasure to introduce Dr. Ellen Esch, the third speaker in our ecology search this year. Ellen got her undergraduate degree from Carleton College, which has turned out a shocking number of great ecology faculty over the years. I'm always very surprised. It seems like there's something going on at Carleton. There's great ecologists coming out of there right and left. Went on to do a PhD at and is currently a postdoc at the University of Guelph in Ontario. Ellen has a really fantastic CV. She has 15 papers on the CV that I have here, and has published across the board in top ecology letters, nature communications, so very successful scientist. And her work is at the intersection of ecosystem and community ecology. Has a lot of implications for ecology and EEB, from a bunch of different things, both in terms of global change and in terms of agricultural impacts. So please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Nathan, and thanks everyone for being here and coming out to my seminar. I'm sure this isn't your normal seminar time, so I really appreciate you all finding time to be here. It's great to be here for a variety of reasons. As Nathan said, I did my PhD at UC San Diego, and I've since been up in Ontario, Canada, so it's great to be back in Southern California in January. I've missed it. It's also really exciting to be part of this plant ecology search, and I know it's an exciting time for you all as well as the department kind of figures out what a piece of that next trajectory is going to look like. And then kind of above and beyond all else, I'm just looking forward to sharing with you the goals of my research program, some findings from past and current research, as well as some future directions. When I was coming out here, I was realizing a fun little tidbit about UCLA too, and that's, well, so I have been on the campus once before to play water polo, but there's only one campus where I was able to conduct research at all of the UC natural reserves that were managed by an institution, and that was not UCSD, it was actually UCLA, so I thought that was pretty cool. So some gratitude for UCLA for providing the stewardship and management and access to Stunt Ranch and the White Mountain Research Center. Both are really valuable community resources. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to present my seminar, which is called Ecosystem Functioning in an Altered World, and I'll also kind of deliver on some insights for sustainability that come out of my research. So to start with an overview of my research program, I study global change and fundamental processes. And so more specifically, I ask how drivers of global change, like nutrient addition, drought, and land use change, can impact community and ecosystem processes. So for an example, I'll ask questions like, how does invasion and competition alter biodiversity and community assembly? This, of course, can have ramifications for how biomass production happens, as well as decomposition patterns. Apart from the carbon cycling aspect, the cycling of other nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus is also something that I look at. So in doing this work at the intersection of community and ecosystem ecology, I work across scales and across systems. So I'll do work in hyper-local environments, doing manipulations on individual plants in the greenhouse, scaling up and doing experimental mesocosms, where I'm creating communities and measuring a suite of variables there. We'll take this to the field and do whole ecosystem level manipulations. And then I also do some work on the global scale by leveraging international collaborations and using remotely sensed satellite-derived data. With respect to the systems, I've obviously worked quite a bit in California, mostly in coastal sage scrubland and invaded grasslands. I've ventured up to the White Mountains and done some research up there, as well as some serpentine grasslands in California. I've worked in tallgrass prairie quite a bit before and after my time in California, and increasingly I'm working on farms and with farmers, as it really relates to this goal of mine to take fundamental ecology theories and apply it towards improving agricultural sustainability. Now, so many ecologists call this intersection of community and ecosystem ecology their home, but increasingly I've been shifting towards the left-hand side of this equation and asking more about the drivers of global change, and in particular, the anthropogenic drivers of global change. So in thinking about the impact that humans are having on the natural world, I think that we absolutely must think about agriculture as a driver. And this map here is showing the extent of croplands across the world. When coupled with pasture lands, agriculture has a footprint at approximately 40% of the Earth's terrestrial land surface. So this is a huge area. As you're all likely aware, modern agriculture has been linked to widespread environmental degradation. There's been some studies that have gained a lot of publicity in recent years with crashing insect and bird populations. There's also really problematic eutrophication, particularly of aquatic systems, but also adjacent terrestrial systems that have been linked to a consequence of modern agriculture. But at the same time, agriculture is absolutely critical for the maintenance of human civilization, and the need for agricultural production is only growing along with the world's population. In the next 30 years, it's estimated that an additional 60% of food will need to be produced. So essentially that leaves us here at kind of this critical junction where we need to figure out how to produce more food and how to do so more sustainably. And I think that how we as researchers and innovators across disciplines and sectors kind of incrementally chip away at this global challenge is going to have really widespread ramifications for conservation goals as well, because anthropogenic and conservation land uses are often at odds, if not dichotomous in many instances. So I think that this is really important. I also think that we can leverage some understanding from community and ecosystem ecology to go a long way towards actually improving agricultural sustainability and overall ecosystem resiliency, and that forms the overarching goal of my research program. I'd also like to point out that I obviously do a lot of experimental ecology, but I also take some other approaches in my research. Here I've shown a structural equation model in the middle of this schematic, which is something that I'm doing more and more of. I think that using multivariate statistical techniques like structural equation models are really important, particularly as ecologists are called on to make inferences about the functioning of a world in an altered state based on findings from individual experiments. And structural equation models are really great for that because they allow for variables to play both response and explanatory roles, and you can also draw causal linkages between variables. And then I also incorporate some geospatial analyses into my research portfolio, particularly as they intersect with the goal of trying to figure out these global drivers of biodiversity and production. Okay, so now that this kind of schematic is set, what I'd like to do for the next 45 minutes is lead you through 4 distinct case studies, which are under this umbrella of my overall research program. The first project that I'll talk about really forms the basis for the rest of the research that follows. It's a socio-environmental synthesis done on farms. And then the 3 projects that follow are much more rooted in kind of traditional experimental ecology approaches. And just so you're aware, I'll keep coming back to this framework throughout the talk and kind of building some key takeaways here, so expect to see this again. Okay, so like I said, the first project is a long-term synthesis of inputs and outputs in agricultural systems. So what I've done here is compile a data set which includes information about production trends over Canada for the last century, as well as information about the financial side behind that, what's really driving these production gains, the cost of inputs. Now, as with a lot of financial information that's hard to access, but I think it's absolutely critical to have, particularly as we think about agricultural sustainability, because in order to be true solutions, I think that sustainable agricultural schemes, they need to make as much economic sense as they make environmental sense in order to be useful. So looking at the data here, this is how production trends have changed over the past century, and it's really no surprise that we've seen increases in production. In this study area, we've seen a tripling in agricultural production, and that's actually just above the rate of population increase over the same area for the same time frame. And we can kind of extend these findings and see them play out elsewhere as well. Now, the other part of this equation is thinking about the
what inputs are necessary in order to produce these production gains. So the next line that you'll see is going to be the cost of intensification. So these are the inflation-adjusted dollars that go towards purchasing agricultural technologies like seed technologies and agrochemicals, including fertilizers and pesticides. I would just like to make the point that while I'm showing inflation-adjusted dollars here, this correlates really strongly to mass-based amounts of these same variables, but using dollars allowed me to fill in some key gaps here. So shockingly, intensification inputs have absolutely skyrocketed over this same time period. They've increased over 50-fold, and this is really creating this widening gap between inputs and outputs. Now this gap is concerning for a variety of reasons. From the producer side of things, it suggests eroding profit margins, which of course can be offset to some degree by gains made in reduced costs in other areas. For instance, labor costs have decreased as mechanization comes online, and also government subsidies can offset this gap to some degree. Now, the second reason that this gap is concerning is because it suggests the potential for negative environmental externalities to arise. You can imagine here if the amount of nitrogen being applied has obviously more than tripled, has skyrocketed, while production gains have been much slower and more incremental in increasing, that could really create the impact or the opportunity for downstream runoff consequences and eutrophication of aquatic systems. So next what I'd like to do is look at this ratio between inputs and outputs a little bit more closely. What's driving
this departure here. So here what I've done is actually take the actual values of the inputs and outputs and put them on the X and Y axis. And here point color is indicating the year. So in this figure, the 1970s are really emerging as a critical transition point for the economic efficiency of the system. And so after that break point, each dollar spent on intensification inputs is yielding less output. And there's also been an increase in the variability of this trend as well. And as kind of a tangential point, I'd like to make note of 2 years here, which I tend to forget. These 2 years right here are severe drought years in the study area. That bottom point that has the lowest economic efficiency was 2001, and starting in that year, Canada actually started naming droughts, much like you would name a hurricane or something like that, another really severe weather pattern. So what's going on here is that
these farmers purchased set amount of fertilizer, applied that, and then without the precipitation, the plants weren't actually able to take those resources and convert it into yield, thereby reducing the overall efficiency here. Okay, so getting back to this, and I'll come back to those 2 years in the next case study here, so don't forget them. Okay, so let's get back to this transition point. There's a range of factors going on here in the 1970s. There's really high demand for agricultural commodities in the 70s, so that drove augmented grain prices, which in turn incentivized the conversion of a lot of native landscapes and natural lands into agricultural production. And this shifting land use has a lot to do with the emergence of this gap. And that's because over the last several years, we've seen an increased reliance on marginal lands for agricultural production. And by marginal lands, I mean lands that have poor soil fertility or poorly drained or have other biophysical constraints, which means that they're not well suited towards high agricultural yielding. Here I've shown marginal lands in shades of brown, and shades of green represent the more fertile land classes here. You'll actually see that we're losing acres of the most fertile land. It's land class 1. That is the negative bar there. And the driving factor happening there is that in this study region, the major urban centers are immediately adjacent to the best quality agricultural land. So as these urban areas have expanded, this prime agricultural land has turned into condos and shopping centers and the like. So this really leaves us at a place where there is this growing reliance on marginal lands for agricultural production, and there's been some great work showing that marginal lands are likely have higher environmental externalities and are overall less profitable. There's the suggestion here is that if marginal lands are behind this widening gap between inputs and outputs, and they're less profitable, there might be some instances where the costs of producing agricultural commodities on marginal land might be outweighed by the benefits that you'll see in grain prices. So there might be other uses for this marginal land, and the work that I'm doing right now is really focusing on trying to figure out how native landscapes can really increase the suite of ecosystem services provided by marginal agricultural land, and in some instances try to be more profitable overall. So the ecosystem services that native landscapes can provide, which might have some economic incentive here, include things like habitat for biodiversity, carbon sequestration and storage, and also some water filtration benefits. Now, there's been a lot of great work showing the value that native ecosystems have, but the piece that's missing is really figuring out what the opportunity cost of foregrowing row crop agriculture is, because, like I said, this has to make economic sense as well. And so when looking at profit margins and looking at this widening gap, the number that jumps out is $87 per acre. And so we know that the value is there in native landscapes. For instance, tallgrass prairie has been estimated to be valued in excess of $500 per acre just based on carbon sequestration benefit, but that's absolutely meaningless if that value can't get connected to the producer who's actually producing that service. So to that end, this entire socio-environmental synthesis really forms the basis of the work that I'm doing in collaboration with ALICE Canada. ALICE stands for Alternative Land Use Services, and it's a farmer-driven, farmer-delivered nonprofit whose goal is to really broaden the suite of environmental and ecosystem services provided by farms. So with ALICE, I've done things like head to the Ontario legislature down in Queen's Park in Ontario, collaborate with farmers, and also collaborate with groundwater engineers, aquatic ecologists, microbiologists, and the like, as we really kind of strive to translate our science into policy and practice, which can actually have some tangible impacts for improving agricultural sustainability. So this has been really fun and dynamic work. It's really exciting, and I think that there's a lot of potential to continue this type of work and research and really try to make some meaningful improvements at this, it's helping solve this global challenge of how to produce more food and do so more sustainably, at this nexus of food, water, biodiversity, energy. So the key takeaway here is really that in looking at the socio-environmental kind of framework, that there's this potential for ecosystem services markets to emerge at a cost that's much lower than the value of these services that can be produced by native landscapes. And that's in part driven by this rising cost of production. So there's some really interesting opportunities happening here. So now that this stage is set for the context that the rest of my research takes place within, I'd like to switch into the findings from the 3 case studies, which are much more rooted in traditional experimental ecology. Now, first up is an experiment where I've looked at interacting resource availability gradients in the greenhouse. This project is really inspired by some fundamental colimitation theory and also work that was done by a collaborator at the University of Guelph. And what this collaborator did, this is his figure, you're looking at a range of different nitrogen application rates, and he's measured corn yield as a response. Now, he did this project over 6 different years, which are indicated by the different line colors. The emergent trend here is that interannual variability, or year, seems to be a way bigger control on corn yield and production than is the amount of nitrogen that's been applied. And the relatively high or low yielding years roughly maps onto how much precipitation was received in that given year. So bottom line, 2012 was the driest year in the system, and the top line was actually the wettest year. So this pattern where precipitation affects yields more than nitrogen application rates, that was really fascinating, particularly in light of findings from that socio-environmental synthesis where there's 2 extreme drought years had really low economic efficiency of the system. So what I wanted to do was to really drill into the mechanism here a little bit more and try to figure out how drought timing can interact with more soil nutrients and really shape plant response here. So what I did is design a greenhouse experiment looking at plant responses to various drought treatments across interacting gradients of nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus, of course, being 2 of the strongest limiters or co-limiters on plant production globally. So to tell you what you're looking at this figure, it's a bit like looking at a topography map, but instead of latitude and instead of longitude and latitude and elevation, what you're seeing is the nitrogen gradient that I applied on the x-axis, the phosphorus gradient here on the y, and then coming out on the z-axis is total plant biomass, with the darker green areas mapping onto larger plants. So there's lots of cool interactions that are happening here, but the first emergent trend is that late season drought is really a stronger, late season water availability, either drought or plants being adequately watered, is really a stronger control. Here, these 2 panels in the plant treatments that either didn't receive any drought for the course of the experiment, or plants where they were exposed to an early season drought, but were adequately watered at the end of the season, they have more dark green boxes than either of these panels on the left, where plants were under continual drought or were exposed to a late season drought only. And so this finding really does corroborate findings from the corn experiment, where drought was a stronger control on plant biomass than was nitrogen. Now, I think the thing that's a little bit more cool is actually the interaction of all of these resource availabilities. And to show that, just like to set up the next figure a little bit, because it's quite a bit more complicated. So what you'll see is on the y-axis of the next figure is going to be the slope of plant response to nitrogen. So to set that up a little bit, think for any given level of phosphorus addition, for instance, extract this line here, and then plot how biomass is responding to that nitrogen availability gradient, and then extract the slope of that line. Are we clear? Okay, great. So that variable, the slope of plant response to nitrogen, is on the y-axis here, and the amount of phosphorus that's been applied is on the x-axis. The 4 different color lines now show those 4 different drought treatments. So what's happening here is that nitrogen is having a stronger overall effect on plant biomass for the plants which are well watered during the second half of the experiment. Again, like before, we see this line with the no drought treatment or the treatment that only had the early season drought having on average steeper nitrogen slopes. So this is suggesting that without adequate end of growing season water, that plants really can't utilize nitrogen to produce more biomass. So this becomes an instance of serial limitation. In an agricultural setting, again, this has some context because excess nitrogen, just based on the form that it's usually applied in agricultural settings, becomes really liable to leaving the system, either through leaching or through volatilization, but it's probably not going to stick around for the next year. So we can think about this as being a pathway for, like a leaky nitrogen pathway, essentially. The other thing that jumps out in this figure is that all of these response curves are saturating at intermediate levels of phosphorus addition, which indicates that there are some co-limitation dynamics at play here. At low levels of phosphorus, nitrogen is having a relatively small impact on total plant biomass, but when nitrogen and phosphorus are added together, kind of in the middle of this figure, we see this strong biomass response, which then saturates. So in total, these findings are really suggesting that in the face of rising precipitation variability, that the risk of negative environmental externalities, like losing nitrogen, could be minimized at intermediate levels of fertilizer addition. So I'd like to put that kind of key takeaway into this framework here. Okay, this next experiment is going to continue thinking about drought, but it's going to be thinking about drought and plant traits. So this case study highlights work that I did based out of UC San Diego, and as you'll all likely know, this is a pretty common site, this landscape, in Southern California. You can see two distinct community types here with a woody, shrub, or tree-based community, often dominated by native species, and then an herbaceous community, which is often comprised of invasive, exotic annual species, either grasses or forbs. Now, one regional consequence of climate change is increasing precipitation variability, as well as those dry years are being increasingly severe and common as well. So in anticipating how altered precipitation will affect this ecosystem, you might expect to see really different responses between the woody and the herbaceous community. So here, shifting community types might have some major consequences for ecosystem functioning overall. Now, these results are the outcome of a field-based experimental manipulation where a bunch of water was moved around, and the different rainfall treatments and amounts that were created are here in the x-axis. I'm looking at biomass production as a response, which I've measured here using the normalized difference vegetation index. You can see that the green line, which is corresponding to shrub biomass, is relatively stable across all of these different water availabilities, while the herbaceous community is really much more sensitive in terms of how its biomass production responds to altered water availability. And so this is really showing that resistance to drought can vary between community types. From this NDVI response, I was also able to extract some phenological information, and I put that into a structural equation model to test if invasion by herbaceous species can increase ecosystem sensitivity to drought via differential phenological sensitivity to rainfall. So it's really no surprise that rainfall is affecting total plant biomass and production. Here you can see that by the lines that are connecting this annual rainfall box to the NDVI or productivity box in both instances. You will notice that this linkage is much stronger for the herbaceous community than it is for the shrub community. This line is twice as thick than this line, which highlights that. The other thing happening here is it also wasn't surprising that phenological dates impacted overall ecosystem productivity. Here, that's any line that's spanning between the phenology and NDVI box. But what is really interesting is that annual rainfall affects phenology differentially between these two community types. In the herbaceous community, rainfall is affecting the timing of biomass green up right here, which then has cascading consequences for growing season NDVI, which we don't see happening in the shrub-dominated community. Rather, in the shrub-dominated community, the impact of annual rainfall on phenology with implications for overall ecosystem capacity for carbon gain is through the senescence date. And so this suggests that there are phenological traits which can drive biomass sensitivity to drought. Now in this system, we see an additional cascading impact of drought on carbon cycling, and this has to do with decomposition patterns and pathways. So the reduced biomass that the shrub community is producing under drought means that there's less of a plant canopy there. So the previous year's biomass production, or the litter layer, ends up being more exposed to solar radiation. This top panel A is showing this. you can see that under different drought scenarios, the herbaceous community goes from almost 100% penetration of solar radiation reaching the litter layer down to levels that are similar to the shrub-dominated community. And again, the shrub community is relatively stable in how much solar radiation hits that litter layer, regardless of the severity of the drought treatment which was applied. Now, for the herbaceous species in particular, exposure to photodegradation can increase the decomposition rate and thereby decrease the persistence of litter in the system. This bottom panel shows that where herbaceous litter that was exposed to UV radiation decomposed faster, whereas the shrub litter was rather insensitive to that manipulation. So here, there's that invasion and drought can synergistically act to reduce carbon uptake as well as the persistence of carbon in the system. Beyond carbon cycling aspects, another effect that we found relating to drought and differences between the woody and herbaceous species had to do with the regeneration niche, or the ability of seedlings to really establish under water-limited scenarios. So specifically, based on the findings from a greenhouse experiment where shrub seedlings were grown across a water availability gradient, either alone by themselves or in competition with an herbaceous annual species, we found that shrubs grown alone had high survival rates, which are indicated by these gray bars. Okay, high survival rates across the board, as well as predictably their biomass production, indicated by these points here, increased as there was more water availability. In competition, that actually switched the response that we saw here, and as water availability increased, we saw declines in shrub survival as well as biomass production. So this was really interesting because it suggests that competition can mediate seedling growth to water availability, but also that the native community likely has some traits which can buffer its resistance to drought. So the key takeaway from all of that Southern California work is that there really might be some species traits to confer resistance as well as resilience to climate change. The final case study is a mesocosm experiment, which also looks at traits, but with respect to how they can influence leaching of nutrients from a system. So this project is inspired by the critical need to retain nutrients within terrestrial systems and limit the flow of energy into aquatic systems. Does anyone know what lake this is? It's a Great Lake? Erie. Yeah, thank you. So this is Lake Erie with one of its harmful algal blooms as seen from space. It's fairly notorious for these harmful algal blooms, and this is largely caused by fertilizer runoff from adjacent agricultural areas, which you can also see in the satellite image, all of the brown area, they're bare fields. This image was taken in October, so largely after everything had been harvested. Anyways, so nutrient management is a really hot topic in the sustainable agricultural world, and this is really rightfully so because nutrient management is really embedded in one of the more perplexing paradoxes of the 21st century, and that's that limitation by nitrogen and phosphorus are two of the biggest constraints on plant production worldwide. So there's absolutely a critical need for those nutrients. But at the same time, their excess is causing widespread environmental, here, and also human health catastrophes with costs in the billions of dollars each year. So this paradox where the limitation by nitrogen and phosphorus is critically important, but their excess is also critically problematic, means that there's really a key issue here of plant uptake and nutrient retention. Now, nutrient uptake by plants is shaped by a range of factors that this experiment looked at, but what I'll be focusing on today is how co-limitation relationships might be an important driver of overall nutrient retention, and that's because we know that biomass production can be a proxy for overall plant demand for nutrients and therefore uptake. So for this experiment, I used a sliding scale, 2 sliding scales actually, of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer additions in some experimental mesocosms. So to set up these figures, you'll be seeing nitrogen losses, which are always occurring across a gradient of phosphorus addition. Nitrogen losses are always going to show up in green. And then in brown, you'll see phosphorus losses. And again, since it's a colimitation experiment, this is always going to occur across a gradient of nitrogen addition. Now, if colimitation theory holds, you'd expect to see reductions in nutrient losses as you add that complementary nutrient, right? So the key finding here is that nitrogen addition is reducing phosphorus loss in line with colimitation dynamics. You can see that line showing a significant relationship for the phosphorus loss, the brown points. Now, mechanistically, I was able to link this to the fact that adding nitrogen had a really strong effect on increasing biomass production. Larger plants under nitrogen addition scenarios have had higher demand for nutrients and therefore reduce leaching of phosphorus. Nitrogen, on the other hand, there was no reciprocal effect where adding phosphorus reduced nitrogen leaching. Now, one other thing I want to point out here in this figure is I think it's really worthwhile to compare these dynamics of what's happening in these mesocosms where I grew plants to what's happening in some bare soil controls here. So in all instances, you can see that the amount of nitrogen leaching is really reduced when plants are grown versus when plants are not grown. On average, there's only about a 50% retention of nitrogen in these bare soil mesocosms, whereas that jumped up to about 75% retention in any instance where plants were grown. Interestingly, we saw that plants are actually facilitating phosphorus loss, with the bare soil mesocosms having less phosphorus loss than any mesocosm where we grew plants, despite an overall really high retention of phosphorus. So now these patterns gain some more clarity when we break them apart and look at them temporally. So let's show that. So up here, looking at nitrogen, temporal patterns of nitrogen loss, you can see that plants are really effective nitrogen sponges, if you will. This solid line shows what's happening in these mesocosms where plants were grown. And you can see that as plants started establishing, as this experiment went on, there were initially really high levels of nitrogen leaching, but then that shrunk to near undetectable levels for the 2nd and the 3rd month here. Whereas mesocosms where no plants were grown had high nitrogen losses throughout the course of the experiment. And in all cases, the amount of nitrogen lost from the system was in excess of what's recommended for drinking water quality standards. In terms of the phosphorus, what we see is a totally different pattern. And here is really where you can see that plants are facilitating phosphorus loss from the system. The mesocosms with plants started off not losing much phosphorus, but then as the plants matured and got larger, we saw more and more phosphorus loss as time went on. In contrast, of course, to these bare soil mesocosms, which had low phosphorus loss. So what's happening here is that these established plants are facilitating phosphorus loss. So we know that plants can modify the rhizosphere environment. And one thing that happens is that plants can actually acidify the rooting zone. Now, phosphorus tends to be much more mobile in acid environments. So these plants the roots are essentially creating highways for phosphorus loss through the system. Now, of course, we know that roots are instrumental for nutrient uptake, and we see that as well. When we have established plants in these 2 months, that's where the colimitation patterns are emerging as significant, with added nitrogen reducing the amount of phosphorus loss from the system. And again, that's been mechanistically linked to an overall higher demand by these bigger plants under nitrogen addition scenarios. Okay, so the key takeaway here is that nutrient retention can be enhanced by alleviating some limitations on biomass production by thinking about colimitation dynamics specifically. So now that this framework is completed, I'd like to take a step back and synthesize some of the key takeaways here and kind of deliver on that second promise of my seminar title, which is to provide some insights for sustainability. So the first big takeaway is that sustainable agricultural schemes, they must be profitable, as was shown by this socio-environmental framework. Kind of as a knock on there, I think that it's pretty, surprising to me that these sustainable agricultural schemes are ironically getting more and more viable as the gap between inputs and outputs rise. Here I'm involved with Alice Canada, as I mentioned earlier, in an outreach capacity to try to actually take this science and turn it into some policies. The second takeaway is that various land management strategies should really consider interacting resource availabilities. The greenhouse experiment showed that the amount of available water can really influence how plants respond and their ability to utilize other soil nutrients. And then the leaching experiment additionally showed that interacting resource availabilities can have strong consequences for ecosystem functioning. For outreach, again here I'm involved with kind of taking these theories and taking them and applying them on farms with Alice Canada, and additionally working with a local conservation organization, the Rare Charitable Research Reserve, up in Canada as it relates to their land management strategies within a really heavily anthropogenically influenced watershed. The third and final takeaway from my research here is that the diversity of traits and species might offer some resistance to changing weather and climatic patterns. And this was a small takeaway from the leaching experiment where we saw that there's really strong temporal trends in nitrogen leaching, so incorporating some phenological diversity might be really important here in limiting nitrogen losses. Of course, this was more clearly shown by the rainfall manipulation in Southern California, and that's where there were these really different responses to drought in two distinct community types. Based on the takeaway of this last point, I've done some substantial outreach with local communities as it really relates to improving ecological literacy related to climate change and also the value of native species. So when I was in San Diego, I connected with the San Diego Natural History Museum pretty intensively to make that possible. And I've been working with the Rare Charitable Research Organization in a similar capacity now since being Ontario. I've also taken kind of those findings and those values into K through 12 classrooms as outreach. Okay, so now that I've told you an overview of where I'm coming from, I'd like to talk quickly about where I'm hoping to go as it relates to my research plans in the immediate and more long-term future. So hopefully by now you've all picked up on the fact that I really like to address questions with hypotheses that are informed by fundamental theory, but that my research generally has these strong applied avenues as well. And you'll see that in my future directions too. So as my future plans relate to improving agricultural sustainability, I'm really excited for the potential to keep making progress towards figuring out ways to broaden the suite of ecosystem services provided by farms. But to date, as you heard about, I've primarily worked with nutrient cycling aspects as it relates to these ecosystem services. So you heard about the work on nitrogen and phosphorus, and I've also done some work on soil organic carbon accumulation patterns. But what I haven't done is I haven't incorporated anything on biodiversity, but there are some really exciting possibilities here to think about diversifying cropping systems. I think that there's an insane amount of bare ground in a lot of agricultural systems, and thinking about leveraging some community theories here and thinking about how to implement continuous living cover and intercropping strategies and some other different kind of ideas here could really be beneficial and go a long way to improving overall agricultural sustainability. I think that there's one really obvious principle in ecology which is not often translated into farms, and that's these biodiversity function relationships. And so there's a lot of, I think, exciting opportunities to keep collaborating with people in that realm. I'm also really excited to think about more closely about kind of how do we buffer risk, both environmental, economic, and also crop production risk in the face of climate change. I think that this aspect leads itself really nicely to thinking about collaborations. I'm certainly capable of thinking about how plants respond to altered scenarios, but I think that it would be really important to have economists as well as climate modelers as part of such interdisciplinary and collaborative teams. So as part of my strategy to do this, I think UCLA offers some really beneficial resources here. From my outsider perspective, the Institute on the Environment and the Sustainability seems really beneficial and excellent for fostering interdisciplinary collaborations. And I think that this air, food, and water theme could be a logical fit for this research. I think it's also nice that there seems to be buy-in from the larger UC system in identifying this as an important and worthy topic of study with the Global Food Initiative. And then in terms of feasibility, I think that the UC Extension branches, including the one here in Los Angeles County, could really help facilitate connections with producers on the ground within this deeply agricultural state of California. The second theme of my research is, of course, to improve ecosystem resiliency. And here I'd really like to hone in on understanding how multiple interacting global change drivers and resource availability gradients can influence ecosystem response. So the bulk of my past work has focused on understanding how either one or two global change drivers can impact ecosystem function. For instance, droughts and invasion and coastal sage scrub down here, or nitrogen and phosphorus in more controlled greenhouse or mesocosm experiments. And so the scope of this has really necessarily simplified the extent to which I've been able to apply these findings to the real world, but in terms of this training and developing my research program, I've really gotten a lot more confident about applying data science type approaches to the analysis and also the design of these experiments, and I'd really like to build on that work. So if taking this research platform to UCLA, I think it'd be quite logical to begin to ask how shifting fire regimes can mediate ecosystem response to other resource accesses as a big consequence of global change here. And I think that relying on remotely sensed data coupled with mechanistic greenhouse and field experiments could be really useful here. It seems logical to do a lot of this work in conjunction with the Lacretz Center. And I also think that this research angle could intersect really nicely with teaching here. From my past mentors, I've seen some really great strategies for integrating learning outcomes and ecological methods and data analysis to having students actually contribute to peer-reviewed quality research. And further, I think that contextualizing teaching activities to really tangible outcomes can really underscore the fundamental principles and help students find deeper meaning from their coursework. So here are some students in the greenhouse to kind of illustrate that. Now, before I totally conclude this seminar, I of course need to thank all of the funding sources which made this research possible. And also I've got great collaborators at UC San Diego and the University of Guelph, particularly in Andrew McDougall and Elsa Cleland's labs. I would be quite remiss, though, if I didn't give a special shout out to some amazing mentees who have either been REU students or done undergraduate theses with me. I've underlined them all here in, I've underlined them and bolded them. There's been 7 of them. And what I think is, really amazing is not only did they make a lot of this research possible by doing some really hard work with me, and these are, the experiments where I have 400 unique treatment levels in the greenhouse, or where we lug around, thousands of gallons of water. But I think that it's also really remarkable that all of these students have presented work as undergraduate students at national research conferences. So these students have been to SACNAS, they've been to ESA, they've also been to CSEE, which is the Canadian Society for Ecology and Evolution, and they've presented components of this research which takes place within this bigger picture here. I really owe some thanks to them as well. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Time for questions?
So the second part of the sort of natural ecosystems in Southern California, you had the trees and shrubs, and you had the herbaceous understory. The trees and shrubs are native, the herbaceous understory is what is
Right.
that result of one flat line, one increasing line. How or in what way can you attribute that to herbaceousness versus shrubiness versus native and non-native?
Yes.
And if it existed in some alternate universe where we had an ecosystem where there were native understory plants, do you think they would be the same? Do you think they would be the same response?
Yeah, okay, so let me just rephrase that question so you can all can hear it. So Brad's question was, with respect to the work that I've done in Southern California, where I showed that different community types can really mediate the community response to drought, to what degree can you attribute those differences in community types to woody versus herbaceous or exotic versus native species? Because the herbaceous species are also the annuals and the natives are the woody species. And that's a really interesting question. I think, a lot of they're hard to untangle, especially in Mediterranean systems. Mediterranean systems often have these native shrub communities and then problematic invasion by herbaceous annuals. There is quite a bit of work that's done in other southwestern deserts where the native species are herbaceous, like out in New Mexico, for instance, in the Renata. There's a lot of native perennial grasses. So again, you're getting some of these life history traits that you can't totally disentangle. But I think overall, one thing that has been unifying between my experiment and work done in other arid places where the life form is switched between the native and exotics is that we see that the natives really do have some traits which allow them to buffer their response to altered precipitation variability. They've had a long evolutionary history in highly variable ecosystems. So that's been quite unifying, but I think to what degree you're going to attribute these various components to is very much an open question.
Do you think for restoration it's important, for restoration biologists who might be thinking about trying to get rid of those non-natives and bring in natives? Is that an important consideration?
I think it's absolutely an important consideration for restoration approaches, because in thinking about restoration, you don't want to just restore the community today. You want to restore the community for coping with increasing environmental variation. And so you need to not only select species that have that ability and those traits, but I know there's been work out of UCLA thinking about the genetic components of that. What about local adaptation? You can kind of go across scales here too and think about restoring ecosystems that have the ability to buffer their function in the face of climate change. Yes?
Actually, considering global change overall, the temperature and drought, they interact more than nitrogen and drought.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so are you thinking to include effect of temperature, episodic drought, or episodic during?
Yeah. So the question here was, just making a comment that the fact that in terms of interacting global changes, temperature and reduced precipitation really interact much more strongly than nitrogen and phosphorus. And that is absolutely something that I'm hoping to do in the future. So I've looked at interacting resource availability gradients of nitrogen coupled with phosphorus across a couple different drought scenarios. But what I think would be more interesting is kind of to create these hyper cubes where you look at a whole like a whole gradient of water availabilities, and you poke and prod at that in different ways. So not only do you change the quantity, but you also change like the intensity of various droughts. So you can do this quite easily in a greenhouse, for instance, if you're applying, 500 milliliters of water in one treatment, apply it once a week or apply it 5 different days, right? So you can alter that intensity. So that's not per se looking at temperature and drought interacting, but it's really drilling in more into this, how precipitation and water availability is, how that resource axis changes plant and community response.
You say you have information about temperature, nitrogen and phosphorus. What is the trend of the interaction?
Okay, so I don't have information about the temperature there, but in thinking about the interaction between nitrogen and phosphorus as it relates to that greenhouse experiment, you have questions about the interaction there? Is that, sorry if I wasn't clear. I don't have any precipitation information. But just to kind of recap, temperature information is what I don't have. But to kind of recap the findings from that experiment, we see there become these transition and saturation points where plant communities can, their response can have a certain trend up until a certain point with a nitrogen or phosphorus availability gradient, at which point we're seeing a saturating response. And what I think is happening there is that, for instance, we saw really strong plant responses to nitrogen up until we got these intermediate levels of nitrogen. And then these plants are growing, they're so much larger that they're little straws and they're sucking out the water availability from the soil and they're transpiring it. And so then we get moisture limitations again. So I think that you have these trade-offs of when different resources become limiting and really kind of parameterizing models to inform how ecosystems are going to function in global change. I think that type of work could be really useful there. So hopefully I answered your question a little bit there, but I'd be happy to talk more later.
Actually, I could rephrase my question quick. If you would conduct all this experiment under 25 degrees Celsius, and then repeat the experiment 35 degrees Celsius, I think you will have more water, more transpiration, less water available, correct?
Correct. Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
So,
yeah, you could play with different temperatures in which you're doing these experiments in order to try to expand the gradient that you're looking at. Absolutely. That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. That was a great talk.